The auctioneer's gavel froze mid-air, his weathered face contorting as he stared at the trembling hand holding 5 crumpled dollar bills. Eleanor Patterson's arthritic fingers clutched her life savings, grocery money for the next 2 weeks, while the crowd's laughter died into uncomfortable silence. This wasn't charity, this was desperation. A woman behind her gasped, "Sweet Jesus, Ellie, what are you doing?" The metal auction paddle clattered to the concrete floor as another bidder stepped back in disgust. The acrid smell of motor oil and rust couldn't mask the stench of something darker, something everyone wanted to forget. In the cage, the broken German shepherd's amber eyes met hers across 15 years of buried secrets. The same eyes that had watched her son die in Afghanistan, the same eyes she'd seen in Michael's final letter home. Going once for $5. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. How could she explain what she didn't yet understand, that this wasn't an auction, but a reunion? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 weeks before that fateful auction, Eleanor May Patterson sat in her kitchen counting Social Security dollars for the third time that morning. $847 had to stretch through another month of property taxes, medication, and the bare essentials that kept a 72-year-old widow afloat in Sweetwater Valley, Alabama. The coffee maker still brewed 2 cups every morning, 15 years of muscle memory she couldn't break. John's mug sat across from her, steam rising from coffee that would grow cold and bitter before she poured it down the sink at sunset. The ritual hurt less now, but the silence in the modest farmhouse still pressed against her chest like a physical weight. Eleanor had been Army strong once. 30 years as a military nurse, patching up soldiers who were barely older than boys, writing letters home for those whose hands shook too badly to hold a pen. She'd married John Patterson when he returned from Vietnam, raised their son Michael in this same house, and buried them both before her hair turned completely gray. The foreclosure notice on her kitchen table spelled out the mathematics of loss in legal terminology, $12,000 behind on the mortgage. Medical bills from John's final battle with cancer had devoured their savings like wildfire through dry grass. 30 days to vacate the only home she'd known for 4 decades. But it was Michael's photograph on the mantelpiece that drew her attention every morning. Staff Sergeant Michael Patterson, 101st Airborne Division, killed by an improvised explosive device outside Kandahar in 2008. 26 years old, still believing he could save the world one village at a time. His final letter home lay pressed between the pages of her Bible. The ink faded, but the words burned into her memory. "There's this dog here, Mom. Brave as they come. Sergeant Major, we call him. He's got my back, and I've got his." Eleanor had tried to learn more about this mysterious canine companion, but military bureaucracy was a maze of classified information and redirected phone calls. The K-9 unit records were sealed. Michael's battle buddies had scattered to the wind. The trail went cold in a labyrinth of paperwork and official silence. Now, staring at the foreclosure papers, Eleanor felt the familiar ache of unfinished business. She'd failed to bring her son home alive. She'd failed to save John from the cancer that ate him alive. She was failing to save the house that held all their memories. Outside her window, the old military depot sprawled across 50 acres of Alabama clay, scheduled for liquidation to pay off government debts. Neighbors whispered about the auction, surplus jeeps, outdated equipment, and unwanted animals that had outlived their usefulness to Uncle Sam. Eleanor poured the second cup of coffee down the drain and made a decision that would have sent John into fits of protective worry. Tomorrow, she would attend that auction, not to buy anything, Lord knew she couldn't afford luxuries, but to witness the dismantling of another piece of military history. Sometimes, she told herself, bearing witness was all an old soldier's mother could do. The morning of the auction dawned gray and humid, the kind of Alabama weather that made bones ache and memories surface unbidden. Eleanor counted her money one final time, $5 in crumpled bills and loose quarters, the remainder of her grocery budget until the next Social Security check arrived. Her neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, had called twice trying to talk her out of attending the military surplus auction. "Ellie, honey, that place gives me the shivers," the older woman had warned. "Nothing good ever came from poking around in Uncle Sam's leftovers." But Eleanor had made up her mind. She dressed carefully in her navy blue dress, the same one she'd worn to John's funeral and Michael's memorial service. If she was going to witness the dismantling of military history, she would do it with dignity. The drive to the old depot took 20 minutes through farmland that had seen better decades. Rusted silos dotted the landscape like tombstones, monuments to agricultural dreams that had withered under economic pressure. The depot itself sprawled across 50 acres, a collection of weathered buildings and overgrown vehicle lots that Uncle Sam no longer needed. Cars and pickup trucks filled the makeshift parking area. Treasure hunters, scrap dealers, and curious locals drawn by the promise of military surplus at bargain prices. Eleanor parked her ancient Honda between a gleaming BMW and a rust-spotted Ford, feeling like an intruder at someone else's party. The auctioneer was a tall, rigid man in his late 50s with steel-gray hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. His name tag read, "Colonel Harrison Blackwood, Liquidation Specialist," and his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. He moved through the crowd with military precision, clipboard in hand, treating the entire proceeding like a strategic operation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwood announced, his voice cutting through the humid air, "we'll start with vehicles, move to equipment, and finish with livestock. Everything must go today. No exceptions, no returns, no warranties." Eleanor found herself swept along with the crowd as they moved from lot to lot. Surplus Jeeps sold for thousands of dollars to collectors and farmers. Communication equipment disappeared into the hands of ham radio operators. Box after box of uniforms, boots, and field gear changed ownership with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. It was nearly 3 o'clock when they reached the final section, a collection of chain-link enclosures housing animals that had outlived their military usefulness. Most were horses, their coats dull and their spirits broken by years of hard service. But in the corner enclosure, separated from the others, stood a lone German shepherd. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The dog was clearly suffering. His black and tan coat was matted and dull, his left rear leg bore the telltale signs of an old injury, and his amber eyes held a wariness that spoke of betrayal and loss. But despite his condition, he maintained a dignity that reminded Eleanor of the soldiers she'd nursed back to health. "Lot 47, Blackwood announced, his voice noticeably cooler. "German Shepherd, approximately 9 years old. Former military working dog with behavioral issues. Starting bid is $50. The crowd's interest was minimal. A few half-hearted bids brought the price to $75 before enthusiasm died completely. The dog had clearly been written off as damaged goods, too old and too troubled to be worth serious money. "Behavioral issues," someone in the crowd muttered. "Probably bit somebody." "Put it out of its misery," another voice suggested. "Ain't worth the food it eats." Eleanor felt anger rising in her chest like flood water. These people saw a broken animal, a liability, a problem to be disposed of. But she saw something else entirely, a warrior who had served his country and deserved better than to be auctioned off like surplus equipment. When the bidding stalled at $75, Blackwood's impatience became palpable. "Do I hear 50? 40? This animal needs to move today, folks." The price dropped steadily as the crowd lost interest. $30, $20, $15. The dog stood motionless in his cage, as if he understood that his worth was being measured in dollars and found wanting. $10. Blackwood called out, his voice sharp with frustration. "Going once at $10. Eleanor's hand moved before her conscious mind could stop it. 5 crumpled dollar bills appeared in her trembling fingers, raised high above the crowd of taller bidders. $5? She called out, her voice carrying across the auction ground with surprising strength. The crowd turned to stare at the elderly woman in the navy dress, some laughing outright at the absurdity of her bid. Blackwood's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, Eleanor saw something flicker across his face. Recognition? Concern? Fear? "Going once for $5, he announced, his voice hollow. "Going twice." The gavel hung suspended in the air like a sword of judgment. Sold to the lady in blue. As Eleanor approached the cage with her $5 bill, the German shepherd's amber eyes met hers across the space between them. In that moment, 15 years of questions and unfinished grief crystallized into certainty. She was looking into the eyes that had watched her son die. The first 3 days with Sergeant Major, for that's what Eleanor had decided to call him, were a study in mutual wariness. The dog had limped from her pickup truck to the barn without a sound, his amber eyes constantly scanning for threats that existed only in his damaged memory. Eleanor had prepared a corner with old blankets and fresh water, but he positioned himself instead by the door, as if escape might become necessary at any moment. He wouldn't eat. Not the dry kibble she'd bought with her last grocery money, not the leftover chicken from her own meager dinner, not even the bacon she'd splurged on, hoping to tempt his appetite. He would drink water only when she wasn't watching, and sleep came in fitful intervals, punctuated by whimpers and phantom running motions that spoke of battles still being fought in his dreams. Eleanor found herself sitting beside him for hours, not speaking, just being present. She'd done the same thing with wounded soldiers during her nursing career. Sometimes healing began with simple proximity to another living soul who refused to abandon them. Her arthritic knees protested the concrete barn floor, but she persisted, reading aloud from the local newspaper or humming hymns from her childhood. On the 4th morning, something shifted. As Eleanor entered the barn carrying his untouched breakfast, she found Sergeant Major standing at attention, his injured leg trembling with the effort, but his bearing unmistakably military. Without thinking, she said, "At ease, soldier." The dog's posture relaxed immediately, and for the first time since the auction, his tail moved in what might generously be called a wag. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as a memory surfaced. Michael's voice on a crackling phone line from Afghanistan. "You should see how these dogs respond to commands, Mom. It's like they understand English better than some of the recruits." That afternoon, while watching the evening news, Eleanor noticed Sergeant Major's reaction to the sound of helicopter rotors on the television. He bolted upright, ears alert, body rigid with terror, before scrambling to hide behind her recliner. The reporter was covering a hospital transport, nothing threatening, but the dog's PTSD was so severe that any reminder of military aircraft sent him into panic. Eleanor turned off the television and knelt beside the trembling animal. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, her own voice shaking as she remembered Michael's final phone call, the sound of explosions in the background, the abrupt disconnection that preceded the chaplain's visit 3 days later. "We're safe here. No more war." The breakthrough came on day 6. Eleanor had been cleaning out Michael's bedroom, a task she'd avoided for 15 years, when she found his old footlocker in the closet. Inside, beneath dress uniforms and military commendations, lay a stack of letters tied with a blue ribbon. Her letters to him, returned after his death, along with photographs and personal items that the Army had sent home. Among them was a letter she'd never seen before, written in Michael's hand but never mailed. The paper was stained and creased, as if it had been carried in a pocket through desert heat and monsoon rains. Her hands trembled as she read, "Mom, I don't know if I'll ever send this, but I need to write it down. There's a dog here, a German shepherd named Sergeant Major. He saved my life today. Sniffed out an IED that would have taken out our entire patrol. But it's more than that. When I'm scared, and I'm scared a lot, Mom, though I'll never admit it, he seems to know. He'll rest his head on my knee or position himself between me and whatever's bothering me. It's like having a guardian angel with 4 legs and the biggest heart in Afghanistan. If something happens to me, I hope someone takes care of him the way he's taken care of all of us. Eleanor's vision blurred as tears streamed down her cheeks. She clutched the letter to her chest, feeling the weight of 15 years of unanswered questions finally settling into place. When she looked up, Sergeant Major was standing in the doorway, watching her with those amber eyes that had seen too much. "It's you, isn't it?" she whispered. "You're Michael's guardian angel." The dog approached slowly, his limp more pronounced as exhaustion and malnutrition took their toll. He sniffed the letter in her hands, his entire body going rigid as some scent or memory triggered recognition. Then, for the first time since the auction, he pressed his head against her knee and released a sound that was part whimper, part sigh, and entirely heartbreaking. Eleanor wrapped her arms around the dog's neck, feeling his ribs beneath matted fur, and wept for all the years they'd both spent mourning the same person. "I'm sorry it took me so long to find you," she whispered into his ear. "I'm sorry they treated you like you didn't matter." That evening, Sergeant Major ate his first full meal in her kitchen while Eleanor called Dr. Martinez, the local veterinarian. The examination the next morning revealed the extent of the dog's suffering: hip dysplasia requiring surgery, untreated infections, and signs of prolonged malnutrition that spoke of deliberate neglect. "Mrs. Patterson," Dr. Martinez said gently, "this surgery will cost close to $3,000. Without it, he has maybe 6 months before the pain becomes unbearable." Eleanor looked at her dwindling bank account, $1,247 remaining after the foreclosure delay she'd negotiated. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough. But as she watched Sergeant Major sleeping peacefully in the exam room, his body finally relaxed in the presence of people who understood his worth, she made a decision that would have terrified her practical husband. "Schedule the surgery," she told Dr. Martinez. "I'll find the money somehow." Outside the veterinary clinic, Colonel Blackwood's black sedan sat idling in the parking lot, its tinted windows reflecting Eleanor's worried face as she helped Sergeant Major into her Honda. She pretended not to notice, but a chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Some secrets, she was beginning to realize, had teeth. The transformation in Sergeant Major over the following 2 weeks was nothing short of miraculous. With regular meals and Eleanor's patient care, his coat began to regain some of its former luster, and the haunted look in his amber eyes softened into something resembling trust. He followed her everywhere, from the kitchen where she prepared his carefully measured portions to the front porch where they sat together, watching the sun set over the Alabama countryside. Eleanor established routines that seemed to calm his military-trained mind. Morning coffee at 6 sharp, followed by a gentle walk around the property. Lunch at noon with an afternoon rest in the shade of the old oak tree where John had built a swing 40 years ago. Evening meals at 5. Then quiet time in the living room where Eleanor would read aloud from books or newspapers while Sergeant Major dozed at her feet. But it was the small moments that convinced her beyond doubt that this dog had shared her son's life in Afghanistan. When she accidentally knocked over a glass in the kitchen, Sergeant Major immediately positioned himself between her and the scattered shards, just as Michael might have done. When thunder rolled across the valley, the dog's reaction wasn't the typical canine fear of storms, but something deeper, a full-body tremor that spoke of memories where thunder meant incoming artillery. The financial reality, however, grew more desperate by the day. Eleanor had called every bank in 3 counties, seeking a loan against her house, but the foreclosure proceedings made her an unacceptable risk. She'd contacted Veterans Affairs, hoping for assistance with medical care for a former military working dog, only to be told that Sergeant Major didn't exist in their system. His records had been classified or destroyed. It was Mrs. Henderson who provided the first breakthrough. The elderly neighbor arrived one morning with a casserole and a manila folder thick with yellowed newspaper clippings. "Ellie, honey, I've been thinking about that dog of yours," she said, settling into Eleanor's kitchen chair with the deliberate care of someone whose bones had earned their aches. "My late husband Harold served as a dog handler in Vietnam. These clippings are from his service days." Eleanor opened the folder to find photographs and articles about military working dogs from the 1960s and 70s. But it was a letter tucked between the pages that made her hands shake. Harold Henderson's handwriting addressed to his wife. "These dogs save lives every day, Mary, but nobody talks about what happens to them when the war ends. Too many of them just disappear into the system, forgotten like yesterday's paperwork. Harold always said the military treats their dogs like equipment," Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice heavy with old sadness. "When they're no longer useful, they get disposed of like any other surplus property." That afternoon, Eleanor drove to the Sweetwater Valley Library and began her investigation in earnest. The librarian, a young woman named Sarah, who treated Eleanor with the special kindness reserved for regular patrons, helped her navigate the internet search databases that might as well have been written in hieroglyphics for all Eleanor understood them. What they discovered sent ice through Eleanor's veins. Military working dogs that developed PTSD or behavioral issues after their service were routinely euthanized or auctioned off to private buyers with no screening process. The lucky ones ended up with former handlers or knowledgeable trainers. The unlucky ones simply vanished from official records. "Mrs. Patterson," Sarah said quietly, pointing to an article on the computer screen, "look at this. It's from 3 years ago." A whistleblower from the K-9 training facility reported systematic abuse of retired military dogs diagnosed with PTSD. Eleanor read the article with growing horror. Dogs subjected to reconditioning programs that involved electric shock therapy, prolonged isolation, and what the euphemistic military language called corrective behavior modification. The whistleblower had been transferred to another base before any investigation could be completed. "Who was in charge of that facility?" Eleanor asked, though her heart already knew the answer. "Colonel Harrison Blackwood," Sarah read from the screen. "He was reassigned to surplus liquidation services after the allegations surfaced." Eleanor drove home with her mind racing and her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. Sergeant Major greeted her at the door with his improving version of a tail wag, unaware that his past was catching up with both of them. That evening, as if summoned by her newfound knowledge, Colonel Blackwood appeared at her front door. He stood on her porch in civilian clothes, khakis and a polo shirt that made him look like any other middle-aged man, but his military bearing remained unmistakable. "Mrs. Patterson, I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I wanted to check on how you're managing with your recent purchase." Eleanor kept the screen door between them, noting how Sergeant Major had immediately moved to her side, his body tense with recognition and something that looked very much like fear. "He's doing just fine, thank you," Eleanor replied, her voice cooler than the October evening air. "I have to be honest with you, ma'am. That particular animal has a history of aggressive behavior." "I'd hate to see an elderly lady like yourself get hurt because she wasn't fully informed about what she was taking on." "Aggressive behavior?" Eleanor studied the man's face, looking for tells like she'd learned to do with patients who weren't forthcoming about their symptoms. "Funny, he hasn't shown me anything but gentleness." Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "These military dogs can be unpredictable. Their training makes them potentially dangerous in civilian settings. I'd be happy to take him off your hands." No charge, of course. Save you the worry and expense. That's very generous, Eleanor said, but we're getting along just fine. After Blackwood left, Eleanor called Dr. Martinez and moved up Sergeant Major's surgery to the following week. Something in the colonel's manner had triggered every protective instinct she'd developed during 30 years of nursing. When someone was that eager to help, it usually meant they were trying to help themselves. The next morning brought both good news and bad. The good news came in the form of an envelope slipped under her door containing $300 in cash and a note for the war hero from a grateful neighbor who prefers to remain anonymous. The bad news arrived with the morning mail, a certified letter from the city inspector's office. Someone had filed a complaint about Eleanor keeping a dangerous animal within city limits without proper permits and insurance. She had 72 hours to provide documentation proving Sergeant Major's vaccinations, temperament testing, and liability coverage, or face fines that could reach $10,000. Eleanor stared at the letter until the words blurred together. The permits alone would cost more money than she had. The required insurance was probably beyond her reach, and temperament testing for a dog with documented PTSD seemed designed to ensure failure. "Well, boy," she said to Sergeant Major, who was watching her with those intelligent amber eyes, "looks like someone's trying to separate us the legal way." That afternoon, Eleanor did something that would have horrified her practical husband. She called the local newspaper and asked to speak to a reporter. If someone was going to use bureaucracy as a weapon against her and Sergeant Major, she'd fight back with the only ammunition she had, the truth. The reporter, a young man named Jake Morrison, whose grandfather had served in Korea, arrived within an hour. Eleanor told him everything, about Michael's letter, about finding Sergeant Major at the auction, about the colonel's suspicious interest in reclaiming a dog he'd been so eager to dispose of. Jake took notes and photographs, asking thoughtful questions that revealed he understood the deeper implications of the story. When he knelt to pet Sergeant Major, the dog allowed the contact without flinching, a significant improvement that Eleanor noted with pride. "Mrs. Patterson," Jake said as he prepared to leave, "I'll need to do some fact-checking, but if even half of what you've told me is true, this story needs to be told. Military working dogs deserve better than to be thrown away when they're no longer convenient." That evening, Eleanor received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Martinez. A veterinary clinic in Birmingham had heard about Sergeant Major's case and offered to perform the surgery at cost, $1,500 instead of $3,000. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez added. "I've been doing some research of my own about military working dogs. Mrs. Patterson, if your dog really is who you think he is, his service record might be worth investigating. These animals receive commendations just like human soldiers." Eleanor hung up the phone feeling something she hadn't experienced in years, hope tempered with determination. Sergeant Major dozed at her feet, his breathing deep and peaceful for the first time since she'd brought him home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were together, and that was enough. Outside her window, a black sedan sat parked across the street, its occupant hidden behind tinted glass. Eleanor pretended not to notice as she drew the curtains closed, but her hand lingered on the telephone. Some battles, she was learning, required reinforcements. The war for Sergeant Major's future was just beginning, and Eleanor Patterson had no intention of surrendering without a fight. The confrontation Eleanor had been dreading arrived on a crisp November morning, 3 days before Veterans Day. She was in the backyard hanging laundry when she heard the sound of multiple vehicles pulling into her driveway. Through the sheets, flapping in the autumn breeze, she saw Colonel Blackwood emerge from a black sedan, followed by a sheriff's deputy and a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase. Sergeant Major, who had been dozing in a patch of sunlight, immediately stood at attention. The transformation was instant and heartbreaking. From peaceful companion to wary soldier, his body coiled with tension, amber eyes fixed on the men approaching the house. Mrs. Patterson, Blackwood called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "We need to speak with you about the animal." Eleanor walked around the house to meet them, her hands still damp from wringing out John's old work shirts. At 72, she had learned to recognize trouble when it wore a three-piece suit and traveled with law enforcement. "Gentlemen," she said, her nursing voice calm and professional despite the hammering of her heart. "What can I do for you?" The lawyer stepped forward, opening his briefcase with practiced efficiency. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm Richard Sterling from the Department of Defense Legal Services. I'm here regarding military property currently in your possession." "Military property?" Eleanor's voice sharpened. "You mean Sergeant Major? I bought him fair and square at a legal auction." "That's where the situation becomes complicated," Sterling continued, pulling out a thick file of documents. "According to military records, the animal designated as K-9 Sergeant Major was killed in action in Afghanistan in 2008. Any dog claiming that identity would therefore be fraudulent military property." Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "That's impossible." "This dog responded to military commands. He knew my son." "Mrs. Patterson," Blackwood interjected, his voice softer but no less threatening, "you're clearly attached to this animal, and I understand that, but you're dealing with classified military information and potentially dangerous equipment. This isn't a pet. It's a weapon that's been improperly released into civilian hands." The sheriff's deputy, a young man who looked uncomfortable with the entire situation, stepped forward with his own paperwork. "Ma'am, I've got a court order here. The dog needs to be surrendered immediately for evaluation and proper disposal." "Disposal?" Eleanor's voice rose to a pitch that would have carried across a battlefield hospital. "You're talking about killing a living creature who served his country with honor." "We're talking about neutralizing a potential threat," Blackwood replied, his mask of concern slipping to reveal something colder underneath. "This animal has documented behavioral problems. It attacked a trainer, Mrs. Patterson. What happens when it attacks you, or a child in the neighborhood?" Eleanor looked at Sergeant Major, who had positioned himself between her and the three men. His posture was protective, alert, but not aggressive. This was not the stance of a dangerous animal. This was the bearing of a soldier protecting his unit. "What trainer?" she asked. "When did this alleged attack occur?" Sterling consulted his files. 3 years ago at the K-9 Rehabilitation Facility. The incident resulted in the animal being classified as unsuitable for civilian placement." "And who was running that facility?" Eleanor's question hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. The silence that followed was answer enough. Blackwood's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. But Eleanor had spent decades reading the faces of people who were hiding something painful. "The administrative details aren't relevant to the current situation," Sterling said quickly. "What matters is public safety and proper military protocol." "Public safety?" Eleanor's voice carried 30 years of nursing authority. "This dog has been nothing but gentle. He comforts me when I'm sad, alerts me when someone's at the door, and hasn't shown the slightest sign of aggression." "Your evaluation sounds more like an execution." It was then that Sergeant Major did something that changed everything. As the tension in the yard reached a breaking point, the old dog walked calmly to Eleanor's side and sat down, placing one paw gently on her foot. It was a gesture of quiet loyalty, of absolute trust, that spoke louder than any testimony about his character. "Mrs. Patterson," the deputy said quietly, "I have to enforce this court order." Eleanor looked at the young man's face and saw something that gave her hope. Reluctance. He didn't want to be here any more than she wanted him here. "Deputy," she said, "before you take this dog to be killed, I want you to know what you're really doing. This animal served 3 tours in Afghanistan. He saved my son's life more than once, and probably saved dozens of other soldiers too. He's suffering from PTSD, just like the human veterans we're supposed to honor, and instead of getting treatment, he's being treated like defective equipment. Ma'am, I understand your feelings, but do you? Eleanor interrupted. Do you understand what it feels like to lose your child to war and then 15 years later find the one creature who was with him when he died? Do you understand what it means to have something that connects you to your boy's final moments? Blackwood stepped forward impatiently. This is getting us nowhere. Deputy, please execute the court order. But before anyone could move, cars began pulling into Eleanor's driveway. The first was Jake Morrison from the newspaper, camera in hand, followed by Dr. Martinez and his veterinary assistant. Behind them came Mrs. Henderson, then Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church, then more neighbors than Eleanor even knew she had. "What's going on here?" Pastor Williams asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had been settling disputes in Sweetwater Valley for 30 years. Jake Morrison was already taking photographs, his camera clicking rapidly as he documented the scene. "Mrs. Patterson, is this about Sergeant Major?" "They want to take him away," Eleanor said, her voice breaking for the first time. "They say he's dangerous, but they really just want to cover up what they did to him." "What they did to him?" Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her elderly frame vibrating with indignation. "What did they do to that poor animal?" Eleanor looked at Blackwood, whose face had gone pale at the sight of the growing crowd and the newspaper photographer. "Colonel, would you like to explain to these people about your reconditioning program? About the electric shock therapy? About the dogs that didn't survive your methods?" The crowd's murmur grew darker, more threatening. These were people who understood military service, who honored veterans both human and canine. The idea of torturing a war hero was anathema to everything they believed. "Now hold on," Blackwood said, his voice rising. "You don't understand the complexities of military animal psychology. These dogs can be dangerous if not properly managed." "Dangerous like this?" Dr. Martinez knelt beside Sergeant Major, who immediately offered his paw for examination. "This dog has been nothing but gentle in my clinic. His only aggressive behavior was defending Mrs. Patterson when a strange man tried to take him away." The deputy looked increasingly uncomfortable as more neighbors arrived. The crowd now numbered nearly 30 people, and their mood was decidedly unfriendly toward the men with the court order. "This is highly irregular," Sterling protested. "We have legal authority here." "You have a piece of paper," Pastor Williams replied, "but we have something more important. We have witnesses to this dog's character, and we have a community that doesn't abandon its veterans." Jake Morrison stepped forward, his notebook ready. "Colonel Blackwood, I've been researching the K-9 rehabilitation facility you ran. Care to comment on the allegations of systematic abuse?" Blackwood's composure finally cracked. "I don't have to justify military policy to a small-town reporter and a bunch of civilians who don't understand national security." "National security?" Eleanor's voice cut through the crowd's murmur like a scalpel. "Or personal security. How many other dogs did you abuse, Colonel? How many other families never got to say goodbye to their sons' companions because you decided they were inconvenient?" The crowd pressed closer, their collective anger palpable. These were people who had sent their children to war, who understood sacrifice and honor. The idea that military animals were being tortured and discarded struck at the heart of everything they held sacred. It was then that Sergeant Major made his choice. Instead of cowering or showing aggression, he walked slowly through the crowd, allowing people to pet him, accepting their gentle touches with the dignity of a soldier receiving honors. His behavior was a testament to his character that no legal document could refute. The deputy finally spoke up. "I'm not comfortable executing this order without a more thorough investigation. There are too many questions here." Sterling's face flushed red. "Deputy, you don't have the authority to override a federal court order." "No," the deputy replied, "but I have the authority to request clarification from the judge before taking action that might be irreversible." As the standoff continued, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced since Michael's death: the support of a community that refused to let her stand alone. Whatever happened next, she and Sergeant Major would face it together, surrounded by people who understood that some battles were worth fighting, even when the odds seemed impossible. The war for Sergeant Major's life had reached its critical moment, and Eleanor Patterson was no longer fighting alone. The victory at Eleanor's house proved to be as fragile as a morning frost. While the deputy had refused to execute the court order that day, Sterling's legal machinery ground forward with relentless efficiency. Within 48 hours, a new order arrived, this one from a federal judge in Birmingham who had never seen Sergeant Major's gentle eyes or witnessed his quiet dignity. Eleanor sat in Dr. Martinez's waiting room, the court papers trembling in her arthritic hands. The surgery had been scheduled for this morning, $1,500 that would drain her savings account to exactly zero, but now it seemed pointless. The new court order gave her 72 hours to surrender Sergeant Major for evaluation and disposition, the bureaucratic language that sanitized what everyone knew would be a death sentence. "Mrs. Patterson?" Dr. Martinez emerged from the examination room, his face grave. "I've completed the pre-surgical assessment. Sergeant Major's condition has deteriorated significantly over the past week. The stress is affecting his immune system, and his hip joint is showing signs of severe inflammation. If we don't operate soon..." Eleanor looked through the window into the examination room where Sergeant Major lay on the steel table, his amber eyes following her movements even in his sedated state. The proud military bearing that had sustained him through the confrontation was gone, replaced by the resigned exhaustion of a soldier who had fought too many battles. "Doctor, if they take him away tomorrow, will the surgery matter?" Dr. Martinez sat beside her, his voice gentle but honest. "Mrs. Patterson, I've been a veterinarian for 20 years. I've seen what happens to animals in military custody when they're classified as problematic. They don't receive medical care, they receive disposal orders." Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choices. Spend her last $1,500 on surgery for a dog who might be dead within days, or save the money and watch him suffer while bureaucrats decided his fate. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez continued. "I've been in contact with a veterinary colleague at Auburn University. She specializes in military working dog psychology and PTSD treatment. She wants to examine Sergeant Major and provide expert testimony about his condition." Expert testimony for what? Jake Morrison isn't just writing newspaper articles anymore. He's been in contact with a lawyer in Montgomery who specializes in military whistleblower cases. They think there might be grounds for a federal lawsuit challenging the military's treatment of retired K-9s. Eleanor felt a flicker of hope, quickly extinguished by practical reality. "Doctor, I can't afford a federal lawsuit. I can barely afford his surgery." The lawyer works pro bono for veterans' cases, and Mrs. Patterson, there's something else you should know. Jake's article has been picked up by the Associated Press. Sergeant Major's story is going national. As if summoned by their conversation, Jake Morrison appeared in the waiting room, his camera bag slung over his shoulder and excitement bright in his young eyes. "Mrs. Patterson, I have news. Good news and complicated news. Which do you want first?" "At my age, son, I'll take the good news while I can get it." The story has exploded on social media. Hashtag Sergeant Major is trending on Twitter, and there are fundraising pages popping up everywhere. People are sending donations from all over the country. Eleanor stared at him. "Donations? For what?" "For Sergeant Major's surgery, for your legal fees, for taking care of other military dogs. Mrs. Patterson, as of this morning, over $40,000 has been donated by people who read your story. The number was so large Eleanor couldn't process it. $40,000 was more money than she'd seen in her entire adult life. It was enough to save her house, pay for Sergeant Major's surgery, and still have money left over for whatever legal battle lay ahead. "What's the complicated news?" she asked, though her heart was already sinking. "Colonel Blackwood held a press conference yesterday. He's claiming that you're exploiting social media sympathy to harbor a dangerous animal. He's provided documents showing that Sergeant Major attacked a trainer and has been classified as unsuitable for civilian life." Dr. Martinez leaned forward. "What kind of documents?" Jake pulled out his tablet and showed them a video of Blackwood's press conference. The colonel stood behind a podium, his uniform crisp and his voice carrying absolute authority. "The animal in question was involved in a serious incident that resulted in injury to military personnel," Blackwood was saying. "While I understand the emotional appeal of this story, public safety must take precedence over sentiment. Military working dogs are not pets. They are weapons that require specialized handling." Eleanor watched the video with growing anger. Blackwood's presentation was masterful, painting her as a deluded old woman who had been taken in by a dangerous animal's apparent docility. "But here's the thing," Jake continued, his voice excited. "I've been digging into the incident he's referencing. The trainer who was allegedly attacked. His name was Sergeant Dave Mueller, and I found him living in Pensacola. Mrs. Patterson, he wants to talk." Eleanor's hands shook as Jake dialed the number on his phone. The voice that answered was gravelly, marked by the distinctive cadence of a career military man. "Sergeant Mueller, this is Jake Morrison from the Sweetwater Valley Herald. I'm calling about an incident involving a German shepherd named Sergeant Major." There was a long pause before Mueller responded. "Son, I've been waiting 15 years for someone to ask me about that day. What do you want to know?" "Colonel Blackwood claims the dog attacked you during training." Mueller's laugh was bitter. "Attack? That dog saved my life. Blackwood was using shock collars set to levels that would have killed a smaller animal. When I tried to intervene, Blackwood ordered the dog to attack me. Instead, Sergeant Major positioned himself between us. He took the shocks meant for me until I could shut down the equipment." Eleanor felt the world tilt around her. "The dog protected the trainer? Ma'am, is that you? The lady who bought him at auction?" Mueller's voice softened. "That dog has more honor in his tail than Blackwood has in his whole body. The attack report was fabricated to cover up the abuse program. I was transferred to Germany the next week to keep me quiet." Jake was scribbling notes frantically. "Sergeant Mueller, would you be willing to provide sworn testimony about what really happened?" "Son, I've been carrying this guilt for 15 years. If there's a chance to clear that dog's name and expose what Blackwood did to those animals, you just tell me where and when." Eleanor took the phone with trembling hands. "Sergeant Mueller, this is Eleanor Patterson. Sergeant Major served with my son Michael in Afghanistan." "Michael Patterson? Staff Sergeant Patterson from the 101st? Mueller's voice broke. "Ma'am, your son was one of the finest soldiers I ever knew, and that dog mourned him like he'd lost his own family. When they brought Sergeant Major back stateside, he wouldn't eat, wouldn't respond to commands, wouldn't engage with anyone. He was grieving, Mrs. Patterson. But instead of giving him time to heal, they subjected him to corrective training that would have broken a human being." Eleanor closed her eyes, seeing 15 years of suffering in a new light. Sergeant Major hadn't been damaged by war. He'd been broken by the people who were supposed to care for him after the war ended. "There's more," Mueller continued. "The shock collar program wasn't just about training. Blackwood was using it to eliminate dogs he considered too expensive to maintain. Dogs with PTSD, dogs with medical issues, dogs whose handlers had been killed. He called it administrative efficiency." Dr. Martinez took the phone. "Sergeant Mueller, this is Dr. Martinez. Sergeant Major's current veterinarian. Are you saying this was systematic abuse? Doctor, what I'm saying is that Blackwood ran a program designed to torture military heroes to death and call it training. And that dog lying in your clinic right now is probably the only survivor who can prove it. Eleanor looked through the window at Sergeant Major, understanding for the first time the full scope of what he had endured. He wasn't just a war veteran suffering from PTSD, he was a witness to war crimes committed by the very people who should have honored his service. "Jake," she said quietly, "how long do we have before they come for him again?" 48 hours, Jake replied, checking his watch. "But, Mrs. Patterson, with Sergeant Muller's testimony and the media attention, I think we can fight this." Eleanor stood up, her decision crystallizing with the clarity that came from righteous anger. "Then let's stop running and start fighting. Schedule the surgery, doctor. And Jake, call your lawyer friend." It's time the world learned what Colonel Blackwood really did to America's four-legged heroes. Outside the veterinary clinic, a black sedan sat in the parking lot, its occupant watching through tinted windows as Eleanor Patterson transformed from victim to warrior. The federal courthouse in Montgomery buzzed with an energy Eleanor had never experienced. Camera crews lined the steps, reporters thrust microphones at anyone willing to speak, and protesters held signs reading, "Honor our K-9 heroes," and "Justice for Sergeant Major." Eleanor sat in the back of attorney Margaret Chen's rental car, watching the circus with a mixture of awe and terror. "Mrs. Patterson, are you ready for this?" Chen asked, turning in the driver's seat to study Eleanor's face. The lawyer was younger than Michael would have been, but her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had fought powerful institutions and won. "Honey, I've been ready for 15 years. I just didn't know what I was getting ready for." Sergeant Major, recovered from his successful surgery but still moving carefully, pressed against Eleanor's side. The past week had transformed him from a broken animal into something approaching his former dignity. The nationwide attention had brought more than donations. It had brought veterinary specialists, animal behaviorists, and former military handlers who testified to his gentle nature and heroic service record. But it had also brought Colonel Blackwood's full legal arsenal. He'd filed countersuits claiming defamation, challenged the authenticity of Sergeant Muller's testimony, and produced a parade of military officials who supported his version of events. The hearing today would determine whether Sergeant Major lived or died, and whether the truth about the military's treatment of retired K-9s would ever see daylight. "Remember," Chen said, "they're going to try to paint you as an emotional old woman who's been manipulated by activist lawyers. Don't let them get under your skin. Your strength is your authenticity. Just tell the truth like you told it to me." Eleanor nodded, but her hands were shaking as they walked through the gauntlet of media attention. Questions flew at her from all directions. "Mrs. Patterson, how do you respond to allegations that Sergeant Major is dangerous? Do you believe the military systematically abused war dogs? What would you say to families who lost soldiers that these dogs failed to protect?" The last question stopped her cold. Eleanor turned to face the reporter, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and cold, ambitious eyes. "Ma'am, what would you say to families whose sons and daughters died because military dogs weren't properly trained due to sentimental attachment?" Eleanor felt rage rise in her chest like floodwater, but Chen's hand on her arm reminded her to stay calm. "Miss, I'd say that my son's life was saved multiple times by this dog's courage and training. I'd say that if we don't honor the animals who served alongside our children, we dishonor our children's sacrifice. And I'd say that anyone who thinks love and loyalty make a soldier weaker has never served in combat." The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Eleanor recognized faces from Sweetwater Valley, Mrs. Henderson, Pastor Williams, Dr. Martinez, and dozens of neighbors who had driven 3 hours to show support. But there were also strangers, veterans from across the country, animal rights activists, and families of soldiers who had served with military working dogs. On the other side of the aisle sat Colonel Blackwood, flanked by a team of military lawyers in dress uniforms. His face was a mask of professional composure, but Eleanor caught him looking at Sergeant Major with something that might have been fear. Judge Patricia Hawthorne called the court to order with the authority of someone who had been settling disputes for 30 years. She was a small woman with gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to weigh the souls of everyone in her courtroom. "This is an unusual case," she began, "involving questions of military authority, animal welfare, and the rights of private citizens. We're here to determine the legal status of the German Shepherd known as Sergeant Major and whether the government has the authority to reclaim him." The government's case was presented by a military prosecutor named Colonel James Hartford, whose voice carried the confidence of someone who had never lost a case involving military property. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward matter of military jurisdiction. The animal in question is classified military equipment that was improperly released to civilian custody. While we sympathize with Mrs. Patterson's emotional sentiment cannot supersede national security protocols. Hartford presented evidence of Sergeant Major's behavioral issues, including the incident report from Sergeant Mueller and testimony from other trainers who described the dog as unpredictable and potentially dangerous. "The military has procedures for handling retired working dogs," Hartford continued. "These procedures exist to protect both the animals and the public. Mrs. Patterson, despite her good intentions, lacks the expertise to properly manage a military-trained attack dog." Eleanor watched as Hartford painted her as a well-meaning but naive elderly woman who had been manipulated by activist lawyers seeking to challenge military authority. His presentation was polished, professional, and completely devoid of the messy reality of human-animal bonds forged in the crucible of war. When Margaret Chen rose to present Eleanor's case, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Chen was a former military prosecutor herself, and she understood both the language and the culture she was challenging. "Your Honor, this case is not about military property or bureaucratic procedures. It's about a conspiracy to cover up the systematic abuse of American war heroes who happen to have 4 legs instead of 2. Chen's first witness was Sergeant Dave Mueller, who had flown in from Florida to testify. His account of the shock collar program sent gasps through the courtroom. He described dogs subjected to electric jolts that would have been considered torture if applied to human prisoners, animals driven to madness by isolation and abuse, and a systematic effort to eliminate retired canines who might require expensive medical care. "Colonel Blackwood told us these dogs were broken and needed to be fixed or disposed of," Mueller testified, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "But they weren't broken, they were traumatized. They were suffering from the same PTSD that affects human veterans, and instead of treatment, they received torture." Hartford's cross-examination was brutal, focusing on Mueller's transfer to Germany and suggesting his testimony was motivated by personal grievances against Blackwood. But Mueller's credibility was bolstered by Dr. Sarah Kim, a veterinary psychiatrist from Auburn University who had examined Sergeant Major. "This dog shows all the classic signs of complex PTSD," Dr. Kim testified. "His behavioral issues stem not from aggression but from hypervigilance and anxiety consistent with prolonged trauma. The attack described in the military reports was actually a protective response. The dog was trying to shield Sergeant Mueller from further abuse." The courtroom fell silent as Dr. Kim described the physical evidence of abuse she had found during Sergeant Major's examination. Old burn marks consistent with shock collar injuries, dental damage from prolonged stress, and neurological responses that indicated severe psychological trauma. But it was Eleanor's testimony that transformed the legal proceeding into something approaching a religious experience. She spoke about Michael's letters, about the bond between soldiers and their canine partners, and about the moral obligation to honor those who had served. "Your Honor, when my son died in Afghanistan, this dog stayed with his body for 3 days. He mourned my boy like family mourns family, and when he came home broken and traumatized, instead of giving him the care and respect he'd earned, they tortured him for showing the same symptoms we see in human veterans every day." Eleanor's voice broke as she continued. "I didn't buy a dog at that auction. I rescued my son's battle buddy. And if we can't honor that bond, if we can't protect the animals who protected our children, then we've lost something essential about who we are as a people." Colonel Blackwood took the stand in his own defense, his testimony a masterclass in bureaucratic doublespeak. He portrayed himself as a dedicated officer making difficult decisions about dangerous animals, a man whose only crime was putting public safety above sentimental attachment. But Chen's cross-examination revealed cracks in his composure. She pressed him about the specific protocols used in his reconditioning program, about the number of dogs that had died in his facility, and about his decision to sell Sergeant Major at auction rather than through proper military channels. "Colonel, isn't it true that you sold Sergeant Major for $5 because you wanted him to disappear? Because a dead dog can't testify about what happened at your facility?" "That's preposterous," Blackwood snapped, his military bearings slipping for the first time. "I followed proper disposal procedures for a dangerous animal." "Disposal procedures?" Chen's voice rose. "Is that what we call the care of American war heroes now? Disposal?" The courtroom erupted as spectators reacted to Blackwood's choice of words. Judge Hawthorne called for order, but the damage was done. The colonel's mask had slipped, revealing the cold bureaucrat beneath. The hearing's climax came when Chen called her final witness, Eleanor herself, but not to testify. Instead, she asked the court's permission for a demonstration. "Your Honor, I'd like Sergeant Major to show the court who he really is." Despite Hartford's objections, Judge Hawthorne allowed it. Eleanor walked to the center of the courtroom, Sergeant Major at her side. In front of 100 spectators, she gave him a series of commands: sit, stay, down, heel. The dog responded with military precision, his movements fluid despite his recent surgery. Then Eleanor did something that silenced the entire courtroom. She sat down on the floor and began to cry. Not performance tears, but the genuine grief of a mother who had lost her child 15 years ago and found a piece of him in the amber eyes of a faithful dog. Sergeant Major immediately moved to comfort her, pressing his head against her shoulder and remaining perfectly still while she sobbed. His response was gentle, protective, and utterly without aggression. In that moment, every person in the courtroom understood that they were witnessing not a dangerous weapon, but a warrior with a heart capable of infinite love. When Eleanor finally stood, her face streaked with tears, the courtroom remained silent. Judge Hawthorne studied the dog, then looked at Colonel Blackwood, whose face had gone pale. "I'll render my decision tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, the judge announced. "This court is adjourned." As they left the courthouse, Eleanor felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her shoulders. They had presented the truth, but truth didn't always triumph over institutional power. Tomorrow would determine whether Sergeant Major lived or died, and whether the sacrifices of military working dogs would finally be honored. That night in her hotel room, Eleanor held Sergeant Major close and whispered the same prayer she had said every night since Michael's deployment. "Please, God, bring my soldier home safe." This time, she might actually get her prayer answered. 6 months after Judge Hawthorne's ruling that sent shockwaves through the military establishment, Eleanor Patterson stood in her backyard watching Sergeant Major play with a new arrival, a young Belgian Malinois named Liberty, who had been rescued from a similar fate. The morning sun cast long shadows across what had once been a struggling widow's property and was now officially designated as Sergeant Major's Haven, a federally recognized sanctuary for retired military working dogs. The transformation had been nothing short of miraculous. The $40,000 in donations had grown to over $2 million as Eleanor's story captured hearts across America and beyond. The old barn had been converted into a state-of-the-art veterinary facility, staffed by Dr. Martinez and two other veterinarians who specialized in military animal PTSD. The property now housed 12 retired canines, each with their own story of service and survival. Eleanor's kitchen table, where she had once counted grocery money in quarters, now served as the command center for a nationwide network of advocates working to reform military animal retirement policies. Her morning coffee routine had expanded to include updates from congressional staffers, veterinary researchers, and military families whose lives had been touched by the four-legged heroes now finding peace in Alabama. Mrs. Patterson? Sarah Chen, the young veterinary assistant who had become Eleanor's right hand, approached with the morning mail. "You'll want to see this one first." The letter bore the official seal of the Department of Defense. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she opened it, remembering the fear such envelopes had once brought. But this letter carried different news entirely. The Secretary of Defense is pleased to announce the establishment of the Military Working Dog Retirement Protection Act. Eleanor read aloud to Sergeant Major, who had abandoned his play session to sit attentively beside her chair. This legislation, inspired by the case of K-9 Sergeant Major and the advocacy of Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, ensures that all retired military working dogs receive appropriate medical care, behavioral support, and placement with qualified handlers or sanctuaries. Eleanor's voice broke as she continued reading. The act established a $50 million fund for retired K-9 care, mandatory psychological evaluations before retirement, and criminal penalties for the abuse of military animals. It was everything she had fought for signed into law by a president who had publicly praised Sergeant Major's courage and Eleanor's determination. But the morning surprises weren't finished. Sarah held up a second envelope, this one bearing personal handwriting that Eleanor recognized from 15 years of nightmares. "It's from Colonel Blackwood," Sarah said quietly. "It was forwarded from his federal prison facility." Eleanor took the letter with steady hands. Harrison Blackwood's court-martial had been swift and decisive once Sergeant Muller's testimony opened the floodgates. Other trainers came forward, military records were unsealed, and a pattern of systematic abuse spanning 2 decades was exposed. Blackwood had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison and dishonorably discharged, his military pension forfeited. The letter was written in the careful script of a man who had learned to choose his words precisely. "Mrs. Patterson, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, and I'm not writing to seek absolution I don't deserve. I'm writing to tell you that Sergeant Major's courage in that courtroom accomplished something my daughter Sarah tried to do before she died. He forced me to face the truth about what I had become. Sarah discovered the abuse program 3 weeks before her accident. She called me that night, crying, begging me to stop what we were doing to those animals. She said that torturing war heroes made us the enemy we claimed to be fighting. I was drunk. I'd been drinking for months to numb the guilt, and I told her she was being weak. That sentiment had no place in military efficiency. She died calling for a ride home because she couldn't trust me to pick her up safely. My daughter died knowing her father had become a monster who tortured the animals she loved. The shock collar program wasn't about training, Mrs. Patterson. It was about my own brokenness, my inability to cope with the cost of war. Every dog that reminded me of the human pain I'd caused, every animal that showed trauma I couldn't fix, became a target for my rage at my own failures. Sergeant Major survived because he had something I'd lost, the ability to love unconditionally. Even after everything I did to him, he protected Sergeant Muller. Even in that courtroom, knowing I was there to destroy him, he comforted you with a gentleness I haven't shown another living being in 20 years. I'm writing this because you deserve to know that your courage didn't just save one dog, it saved the memory of my daughter. Sarah would be proud of what you've accomplished. She would say that Sergeant Major finally found someone worthy of his loyalty. I will spend the rest of my life trying to atone for what I did. I've started a correspondence course in veterinary therapy, hoping that someday I might help repair some of the damage I've caused. It's probably too little, too late, but it's all I have to offer. Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like. Thank you for fighting for the voiceless, and thank you for loving my victims when I couldn't love even myself. Respectfully, Harrison Blackwood. Eleanor set the letter down and looked at Sergeant Major, who was watching her with those amber eyes that had seen too much, but somehow retained their capacity for trust. She thought about forgiveness, about the complexity of human nature, about the long journey from brokenness to healing. "What do you think, boy?" she asked. "Do we write him back?" Sergeant Major's tail moved in what Eleanor had learned to interpret as qualified approval. After all they had been through together, she trusted his judgment about human character more than her own. The afternoon brought visitors. It usually did now. A bus full of high school students from Birmingham arrived for their monthly tour, part of a program that taught young people about military service and animal welfare. Eleanor watched from the porch as Dr. Martinez led them through the facility, explaining how each dog's unique trauma was being addressed with patience and expertise. But it was the individual visitors who touched Eleanor's heart most deeply. Today brought Martha Rodriguez, whose son Carlos had served with a bomb detection dog named Zeus in Iraq. Zeus had been retired 2 years ago and placed with a family in Oregon through the new adoption program Eleanor had helped establish. "Mrs. Patterson," Martha said, tears streaming down her face as she hugged Eleanor, "Zeus is thriving. He sleeps with my granddaughter every night and has never shown a moment of aggression. If you hadn't fought for Sergeant Major, Zeus might have ended up in one of those horrible facilities." As the sun began to set, Eleanor found herself in her favorite spot, the front porch swing that John had built 40 years ago, with Sergeant Major stretched out at her feet and Liberty curled up against his side. The younger dog still had nightmares, still flinched at sudden sounds, but she was learning to trust again under Sergeant Major's patient guidance. The phone rang. It often did now. Calls from military families, veterinarians, journalists, and policymakers who wanted to learn from Eleanor's experience. Tonight's caller was Jake Morrison, now working for the Washington Post and covering military affairs. "Mrs. Patterson, I wanted you to be the first to know. The Pentagon announced today that they're naming their new K-9 training facility the Michael Patterson Memorial Center for Military Working Dog Excellence. They want you to speak at the dedication ceremony." Eleanor closed her eyes, imagining Michael's reaction to having a military facility named in his honor. He would have been embarrassed by the attention and proud of the cause. "Jake, I'll speak if Sergeant Major can be there with me. Those dogs deserve to see that one of their own not only survived, but thrived, Mrs. Patterson. I think having Sergeant Major there is exactly what they had in mind." After the call ended, Eleanor sat in the gathering twilight, reflecting on the journey that had brought her from a lonely widow counting grocery money to a national advocate whose work was changing lives across the country. The foreclosure notice that had once terrified her was now framed on her kitchen wall, a reminder of how close she had come to missing her true calling. "You know what, boy?" she said to Sergeant Major, who had moved closer to rest his graying muzzle on her lap. "I used to think God took Michael away from me, but maybe he just sent him ahead to prepare the way for something bigger than either of us could imagine." Sergeant Major's tail thumped once against the porch boards, and Eleanor chose to interpret it as agreement. After all they had been through together, after all the battles fought and won, she had earned the right to believe that some purposes are worth waiting 72 years to discover. In the distance, Liberty barked once, not in fear or aggression, but in the pure joy of a young dog who had finally learned that tomorrow could be better than yesterday. Eleanor smiled, understanding that the sound represented everything she had fought for, the right of every living being to heal, to hope, and to find their way home. The war was over. The healing had begun, and in a small town in Alabama, love had proved once again that it was stronger than fear, more enduring than bureaucracy, and worth every sacrifice required to protect it. Sometimes the most profound love stories aren't between people, they're between broken souls who refuse to give up on each other. Eleanor Patterson thought her purpose ended when she buried her son and husband, leaving her counting quarters at a kitchen table where 2 cups of coffee had become a daily ritual of grief. At 72, facing foreclosure and forgotten by a world that sees elderly women as invisible, she made a $5 decision that would transform not just her life, but the lives of countless military heroes with 4 legs and hearts bigger than the bureaucrats who abandoned them. What Eleanor discovered in those amber eyes wasn't just her son's battle buddy. It was proof that it's never too late to fight for something that matters, never too late to find your true calling, and never too late to show the world that love doesn't make you weak. It makes you unstoppable. Her story reminds us that our greatest chapters might still be unwritten, that purpose can find us when we think we have nothing left to give, and that the courage to stand up for the voiceless can echo across generations. Have you ever discovered unexpected purpose during life's most challenging moments? What $5 decision changed your perspective on what really matters? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might inspire someone who needs to hear it today.